So thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Carla Hyland, and I'd like to offer a brief introduction of these gentlemen who have joined us here today to talk with us about Ponderosa Pine Forest and other wonderful things. We have Stephen Arno. Stephen Arno obtained a PhD in forestry and plant science from the University of Montana in 1970. He was a resident forester with the USDA Fire Sciences Laboratory in Missoula before retiring in 1999. He has practiced restoration forestry on his family's Ponderosa Pine Forest for more than 40 years and has written several books related to trees and forests. A committed denizen of the forest, he enjoys the long process of harvesting firewood and using it to heat the family home. So that's Stephen. And seated next to Stephen is Carl Fiedler. Carl Fiedler retired from the University of Montana in 2007 after 25 years as professor of forest management and stints with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Forest Service Intermountain Research Station. His primary pastime since the 1970s has been traveling the backroads of the West, visiting and studying forests of every kind, but especially Ponderosa pine. During summers, he also conducted workshops on Ponderosa pine management and restoration forestry for public agencies and Indian tribes in nearby every western state. These experiences, plus visits to all but a few of the Ponderosa of the Ponderosa places profiled in the book, opened his eyes to an ever larger and more fascinating world of Ponderosa pine. His aim in the book, Ponderosa, People, Fire, and the West's Most Iconic Tree, is to capture and communicate this passion to the reader. So we'll start with these gentlemen, and I'll also introduce to you Greg Gordon, seated over here. Greg was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. He moved to Missoula in 1989 to attend graduate school, and after receiving his MS in Environmental Studies from UM, he continued to live in Montana while teaching field studies programs. He received his PhD in history from the University of Montana in 2010 with his dissertation on A.B. Hammond. His book, When Money Grew on Trees, A.B. Hammond and the Age of the Timber Baron, was published in 2014, and as of about 30 minutes ago, we've been notified that it is a finalist for the Washington State Book Award. He now lives in Spokane and is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Gonzaga University. His previous book, Landscape of Desire, explores the natural history of Utah's canyon country. There you go. I'll turn it over to you two then.
Thank you. In terms of Steve's and my presentation, I'm going to just start with several excerpts from the first couple of chapters in the book. Steve will have a few readings from the middle part of the book, and then I'll end with a couple examples from our part 2, which is Ponderosa on and off the beaten path. And so I'll start now with chapter Indians in the Pines. The oldest documented use of Ponderosa pine by Native Americans was as supports in underground pit houses, which were a primary form of shelter until about AD 500. The next big jump in the use of Ponderosa was by the Anasazi in the construction of their pueblo in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. The most acclaimed was Pueblo Bonito, which consisted of about 650 rooms. Construction of the Anasazi Pueblo complex required an estimated 200,000 trees, mostly Ponderosa pine. Yet the closest pine forests lie 50 miles southwest in the Chuska Mountains. How hundreds of thousands of Ponderosa logs were transported such a long distance remains an enigma. Strontium isotope analysis comparing timbers in the Pueblos with pine trees in various surrounding mountain ranges confirmed that some of the timbers did indeed come from the Chuska Mountains, but many others came from mountains located more than 100 miles northwest in Colorado. Indians favored large old ponderosas not only for camping, but also for negotiations and trade. Chiefs of the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille tribes negotiated with the territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, for 9 days in a grove of old ponderosa the Salish called clemé, or trees with cut-off limbs, before signing the Hellgate Treaty on July 16, 1855. Many of the old trees still stand and can be seen at Council Grove State Park, west of Missoula. Chapter Pioneers in the Pines. The first European to encounter ponderosa pine was likely Cabeza de Vaca, a Spaniard who shipwrecked off the Texas coast in 1528 and wandered the southwest for the next 8 years. In a later report, he described pinyon pine and another pine, presumably ponderosa, growing in the mountains. Besides the massive cutting of pine to fuel gold rush-related development, California's ponderosa pine forest provided another important product during the Civil War. Secession of the southern states left the North short of turpentine and resins, products essential to its fleet of wooden ships and usually obtained from pines in the southeastern United States. Given the North's predicament, one California historian noted that the magnificent pine forests of California and the Sierra Nevada, quote, were invaded by men who gouged great holes in the bases of ponderosa pines in order to collect pitch that would be made into turpentine and resin. Another historian ruefully described the consequence, quote, all that was left to commemorate the California effort were the rocks embedded in the trees where they had been placed to plug the holes through which the pitch had been gathered. Ponderosa pine also played a key role in creation of a national park. In 1904, a Canadian artist named Julian Itter moved to Seattle and spent the following summer painting scenes in the Lake Chelan area on the east edge of North Cascades. In 1906, Itter's paintings were featured in an exhibition in Seattle, and one painting, Ponderosa Pines in the North Cascades, received rave reviews. Leveraging his popularity, Itter traveled to Washington, D.C. and visited President Teddy Roosevelt, where he proposed creating a national park. Decades later, in 1968, the area was formally dedicated, and Julian Itter would become known as the founding father of North Cascades National Park.
So I'm going to read a short excerpt. I'm going to try to get out of the bright light. Yeah, that's a little better. A short excerpt and then a little bit longer one. After struggling for months to cross scorching plains and deserts, wagon-trained pioneers rejoiced at the first sight of tall trees as they approached Oregon and California. These travelers soon entered a realm of giant pines and grassy glades, well-spaced stands of stately trees with stout, spreading limbs and great columnar trunks clad with platy orange-brown bark. In 1853, on the Oregon Trail, Rebecca Ketchum recorded her impressions of these forests from the hard seat of a covered wagon or likely while walking to lessen the load on worn-out oxen. Quote, our road has been nearly the whole day through the woods. That is, if beautiful groves of pine trees can be called woods. That was referring to Ponderosa. The country all through is burnt over so often there is not the least underbrush, but the grass grows thick and beautiful. Miss Ketchum's journal account vividly described the effects of frequent low-intensity fires that historically burned along the ground, keeping the forest open and inviting. Well, we made clear that Ponderosa is the most fire-dependent forest type of the West, and so we have chapters on the fire ecology and then also on the crusade against fire. And a quote from K. Ross Toole seems to fit the predicament of the crusade against fire, which is the longer, I'm going to read a longer excerpt about it, but K. Ross Toole's quote, apply to dryland farming in central and eastern Montana. But I think it fits the idea of eliminating fire from ponderosa pine forests, and we'll talk about that more in the next excerpt. But his quote was, "No human force can superimpose a theory over the facts of nature, nor on any appreciable scale can nature be made to fit a mold of human design." So, great improvements in fire prevention, detection, communication, mobilization, equipment, and other technologies seem to pay off in reducing the extent and damage caused by wildfires in the West. The area burned annually in wildfires in the 11 fire-prone western states had often exceeded 1.5 million acres from the onset of records in 1916 until the early 1930s. Then a marked diminution of the area of fires occurred. For 50 years, there was never another year with 1.5 million acres burned. However, then in the early 80s, an astounding reversal took place. Since 1983, the annual extent of western wildfires has averaged more than 1.5 million acres, and many years have produced wildfires totaling more than 3 million acres, including this year. This modern era has been marked by enormous fires, despite continuing improvements in dispatching firefighters, better equipment and technology, and increased expenditures. The Forest Service covertly allowed controlled burning in the South, sometimes under the guise of administrative experiments. That's the Southeast. Finally, in December 1943, the wartime manpower shortage for fighting fires and the swelling tide of evidence and agitation for permission to burn from within and outside of forestry caused Chief Forester Lyle Watts to sanction fire's use, but only in the South. Meanwhile, the January 1943 issue of the Journal of Forestry contained a startling and revolutionary article by a government forester making a case for controlled burning in ponderosa pine forests of the West. The disturbing light burning movement that had been snuffed out by 1930 was suddenly reignited, and for the first time promoted in the foremost forestry journal by an experienced forester. The title, quote, "Fire as an Ecological and Silvicultural Factor in the Ponderosa Pine Region," promised that for the first time the case for using fire would be based on its historical ecological role as well as its potential contribution to timber management. The author, Harold Weaver, was employed by the Indian Service, which is now called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in the Department of Interior, which was a relatively little-known agency managing Indian reservation lands. And he built his case based on years of careful observation. Still, as David Clare recounts in his book, Burning Questions, America's Fight with Nature's Fire, Weaver's article barely passed through a gauntlet of skeptical reviewers. Also, Weaver's byline in the journal carried the unusual disclaimer, "This article represents the author's view only and is not to be regarded in any way as an expression of the attitude of the Indian Service on the subject discussed." No doubt this was an attempt to shield his employer from Forest Service wrath, which could ultimately have resulted in less funding because the Forest Service controlled the fire suppression funding. Responding to a 1951 article by Weaver, the distinguished University of California professor Emanuel Fritz congratulated him for continuing to study the use of fire in silviculture, adding that quote, "In the early days of forestry, we were altogether too dogmatic about fire and never inquired into the influence of fire on shaping the kind of virgin forest we inherited. Now we have to eat crow." Weaver's work helped encourage another even more controversial advocate for controlled burning, this time located in California, where light burning promoters had so annoyed the Forest Service. Harold Biswell had earned a PhD in botany and forest ecology at the University of Nebraska. Then he spent several years as a Forest Service researcher in the Southeast, where he became acquainted with controlled burning in pine lands as it was being introduced in the 1940s. In 1947, Biswell became a professor of forestry and plant ecology at the University of California, Berkeley. As he departed the Forest Service, Edward Kotok, chief of research, admonished Biswell to stay out of controlled burning when he got to California. But that did not happen. Both of these men, Weaver and Biswell, lived to see the Forest Service make a stunning reversal of policy in the late 1970s and embrace prescribed burning in ponderosa pine as well as other vegetation types.
Okay, I'm going to finish up our presentation with three rather disparate examples from part 2, ponderosa pine on and off the beaten path. And this part of the book is sort of like a visitor's guide, but it features sometimes a single tree, sometimes a stand or a landscape that has some interesting or unique, it may be everything from the bizarre to the beautiful, to it may have spiritual, educational, scientific, cultural value, and so that's where these examples come from. The Mogollon Rim is a 200-mile-long escarpment or cliff that marks the southern edge of the Colorado Plateau in central Arizona. It offers striking vantage points overlooking the largest contiguous ponderosa pine forest in the country. Martha Summerhays, wife of an Army officer and author of the book Vanished Arizona, vividly described the views from the rim while traveling the General Crook Wagon Trail in 1874. Quote, "Surely I have never seen anything to compare with this, but oh, would any sane human being voluntarily go through with what I have endured in this journey in order to look upon this wonderful scene?" This one from Nebraska. Beginning in 1890, Charles Bessie, a professor at the University of Nebraska, urged the federal government to plant trees in the Sand Hills, a treeless region of north-central Nebraska. Settlers had moved into the area following the Homestead Act of 1862 to claim there were 160 acres, but found the soils too sandy to raise crops. The free acreage was later upped to 640, but old-timer Caroline Sandoz Pfeiffer remained skeptical. Quote, "A person couldn't even starve properly on 160 acres, but on 4 times the land could starve just fine." Though unsuitable for farming, Bessie believed that planting trees would help control erosion, provide a source of fuel and fence posts, and create a sanctuary for wildlife. After repeated coaxing, the Federal Division of Forestry established a small ponderosa pine plantation on a local ranch in 1891. Bessie continued lobbying and finally convinced President Teddy Roosevelt to create a forest reserve in 1902, later renamed the Bessie Ranger District of the Nebraska National Forest. Approximately 60,000 acres have been planted since 1902, primarily with ponderosa pine seedlings from the Bessie Nursery. And our last sketch comes from our neighbors to the north in British Columbia. Justice was harshly served during the rough and tumble era of the Fraser River Gold Rush, often by hanging the accused from the end of a rope. During the late 1850s, 12 men were believed hung from a gnarled old ponderosa pine known as the Lillooet Hanging Tree. Entries in the presiding judge's diaries show that he sentenced several men accused of stealing cattle to hang in order to keep the peace, while the other victims were likely common thieves hung by frontier justice. As one old-timer put it, quote, "If you're going to hold a hanging, that's for sure a tree you'd think about using. and a damn pretty view for the one being hanged to see. The hanging tree died years ago, but its skeleton still stands in Cayush Park overlooking the town of Lillooet and the Fraser River about 70 miles west of Kamloops.
Thank you. I guess we'll now turn it over to Greg, and the slide has been here for us to get to know for a while.
Trying to figure out how to make a transition from Ponderosas to A.B. Hammond. The only thing I can think of is Ponderosas is where he got his money. So just want to sort of start with a little bit of an abrupt statement. If it wasn't for A.B. Hammond, none of us would be sitting here today. More than any single individual, A.B. Hammond built the city of Missoula into what it is today. He built the Northern Pacific, the Bitterroot Railroads. He ensured that Missoula would be a transportation hub. In founding the Missoula Mercantile Company, he established Missoula as a commercial center, and in the timber industry, he made it into a center for processing and distributing natural resources. And finally, bringing the University of Montana to Missoula ensured the town's economic mainstay. Despite all this, his memory and name have been deliberately erased from the town's memory. And I mean literally deliberately. If there was a street, used to be named Hammond Street, it's now named Gerald. You can go down there and you can see where his name was scratched off the concrete. There is still one little piece that says Hammond, but there's other places where it was deliberately scraped off. Why? In fact, 2 years after he left for California in 1896, the city council voted to rename Hammond as Gerald Street after one of the Higgins boys. And for those who are familiar with him, he's known as one of the classic jerks in Montana history. Again, why? How did someone who did so much for our state end up with such a poor and largely forgotten reputation? So, in sort of answering that question, give you a little bit of background on him. You can see Hammond's quarter century spanned the most tumultuous and significant years in the state's history. And in fact, his life is framed with the conflict of natural resources, trees in particular. Keep in mind, of course, wood, as pointed out, is the primary building material for everything from houses to steamships. It's also the primary energy source for the 19th century. So, in many ways, Hammond's worldview was shaped by where he grew up. Let me go over here a little bit. In Madawaska, New Brunswick. And he's the fourth of 6 children. He grew up in the privileged position as the son of the local magistrate. And for several hundred years, New Brunswick was the timber colony for New England, or for the New World. For the British Empire, the timber from Madawaska and New Brunswick fueled all the ships of the British fleet. And the logging that occurred there was done on either side of the border with little regard to any ownership. And this sort of cavalier attitude toward timber poaching would be transposed to the American West by men like A.B. Hammond. A few years after he left New Brunswick, he arrived in the goldfields of Montana. He and his brother traveled up the Missouri River, and hearing reports that the gold was all played out, that Andrew actually jumped ship in the Mussel Shell and tried his hand at being a woodcutter for the steamboat traffic. George went on to Fort Benton, and at the same time, Andrew found himself embroiled in another struggle over natural resources on the Northern Plains. We talked about Ponderosa. Cottonwood on the Northern Plains was an incredibly important resource for Native Americans. They used it as shelter, they used it fodder for their horses, and men like Hammond were busy chopping up cottonwood to feed the steamships. So his activity as a woodhawk triggered a short but intense woodhawk war of 1866 to 1868 on the upper Missouri River. And this sort of framed his life. Conflict over natural resources. The actors changed from Indians to the federal government to competitors to conservationists, but the central question was the same, is who would control access to the nation's forest. 25 years later, we're going to sort of jump ahead. A.B. Hammond controls every major business in Missoula, in western Montana, including the First National Bank of Missoula, the Missoula Water Works, the Missoula Street Railway, the Missoula Gazette, the Florence Hotel, the Downtown Blocks, the Missoula Real Estate Association, the Bitterroot Railroad, and the area's only flour mill. Hammond's Big Blackfoot Milling Company in Bonner dominated the region's timber industry. So here is the corner of Front and Higgins in 1890. It's also the center of power and money in western Montana. The First National Bank of Missoula, here on the southeast corner, the nation's, or the state's most solvent and financially sound bank. It's actually one of the few that weathered the Panic of 1893. We have the Hammond Block, which no longer exists. On the opposite corner, the Florence Hotel, the original Florence Hotel, and named after Hammond's wife, all controlled by A.B. Hammond. And of course, the Missoula Mercantile Company, which is essentially the super Walmart of the day. This underpinned all of Hammond's empire. It's the largest wholesale and retail business between St. Paul and Portland, and western Montana's largest employer, even more than the Northern Pacific. And the Merc is really the only of the 4 buildings that survives today. So if you lived in Montana, Missoula, in 1890, you probably worked for one of Hammond's enterprises. You bought your groceries, your dry goods, your hardware, your farm implements, your wagons, and your perfume from the Merc. If you wanted water, electricity, you got it from Hammond. If you wanted to build a house, you got your lumber from Hammond. If you wanted to buy a house, you got your loan from Hammond. If you were farming the Bitterroot, you needed to send your wheat on his railroad to his flour mill, which then sold it at the Merc. And if you wanted a government job, you went to Hammond, who, like Tammany Hall, dispensed patronage through his bought politicians. And then when you died, you were buried in his cemetery. Because Hammond so dominated the economic and political landscape in Missoula, he was able to leverage Missoula County's votes. And in the 1890s, Missoula had or 1880s, this would be, Missoula had the 3rd most populous county against the rest of the state, who dominated their counties, Daly and Butte and Hauser and Helena. And through backdoor shenanigans and political dealings, Hammond was able to get the university in Missoula in exchange for supporting Helena's bid for the capital. Hammond had little desire for public education or higher education, but he did own most of the land south of the river. And he stood to make a handsome profit in real estate in the University District. The question is, how did he go from being a woodcutter on the Missouri River to ending up as one of the state's most wealthiest people? A few years after arriving in Missoula, he got a job as a sales clerk with the firm of Bonner Welch, which eventually became Hammond, Eddie Hammond and Company. And in 1883, for reasons I still haven't figured out, a little mysterious, a grocery store, the Missoula Mercantile Company, gets the contract to build the Northern Pacific Railroad. It'd be like the butcher at Albertsons getting the contract to build a space shuttle. There's something going on, we don't really know what happened. But the Missoula Mercantile Company ends up with a contract to build the Northern Pacific clear from Miles City to Sandpoint. Supply all the construction lumber, which is 3,000 cross ties per mile. The trestles, this is the largest wooden structure in its day, the Merritt Trestle, just up the road here. And so they're providing all the construction materials, lumber, blankets, everything except the actual steel for the rails to build the Northern Pacific Railroad. But to gain access to the timber to use to build the railroad, they incorporated Hammond and his partners something called the Montana Improvement Company, which soon got into trouble for cutting timber on public land and began Hammond's descent into infamy. So the Northern Pacific gets its legal right to harvest timber from the railroad grant, which says you can cut timber from adjacent public lands for the construction of the railroad. The improvement company continued to log public lands after the railroad was built, and they interpreted adjacent very loosely, sometimes cutting timber hundreds of miles away from the right-of-way. Animosity toward the improvement company increased as Hammond's employees went out into the forest and threatened to take any trespassers to prison. The company began viewing the forest, the public forest, as its own private asset, regardless of actual ownership. With all these citizen complaints, the Cleveland administration filed 31 indictments against Northern Pacific and the Improvement Company for stealing more than $600,000 of public timber. The U.S. government also charged Hammond with fraudulently acquiring about 12,000 acres. But Hammond managed to get the case suspended for 25 years. I want to leave room for questions here, but I want to briefly tell you a little story, sort of an insight into sort of Hammond's personality. Hammond built the Bonner Mill for the Big Blackfoot Milling Company, and during the sort of Clark-Daly feud, Hammond and Bonner and Daly got together and sort of abandoned William A. Clark to support a Republican candidate, Thomas Carter, who actually went to Washington, D.C. to get the timber suits dismissed. He was successful in that, and that caused a lot of animosity between Marcus Daly and Butte and A.B. Hammond and Missoula. And they went back and forth for years trying to be friends, and they were enemies, and they were friends and enemies. They sort of, what do they call them now, frenemies? So, but in the Bonner, Daly, Hammond's largest customer for the Bonner Mill was Butte, Daly's mines in Butte. The mines consumed a massive amount of timber for the uprights in the in the mine. They used a lot of timber to burn to create before they were using coal for the smelters. They used wood to melt down the ore. You can imagine how much wood that took. So by far his biggest customer was Marcus Daly, and Daly, realized that he would be better off if he could just buy the Bonner Mill and have his own lumber mill and his own timberlands instead of having to rely upon somebody else. And so Hammond recognized that Daly really wanted this, and he kind of knew the guy a little bit. And so 1898, Hammond had left Montana for Oregon to build some railroads in Oregon, and he knew that he could play Daly along, and he set the price of the Bonner Mill at $1 million. And Daly considered this a complete absurd amount of money, and he had his agent named Mike Donahue try to negotiate with Hammond. But Hammond knew that Daly could afford $1 million pretty easily. And he also knew that the longer he held out, the more Daly wanted the mill. And so when Donahue came back in March of '89, Hammond raised the price on him $50,000. So this was a negotiation 1898 style. I'll set the price and then you come back and I'll raise it on you. So cutting it. So outraged, Donahue departed for Anaconda, only to come back the following month, and this time Hammond bumped up the price another $100,000. Donahue expressed his annoyance to Daly, saying Hammond is a very difficult man to deal with, and Hammond was enjoying the game, bumped it up another $100,000 just to keep Daly at bay while he was on the West Coast. Finally, that summer, Hammond returned to Missoula, resumed negotiations, and in August, Hammond and Daly settled on a price of $1,480,000, nearly $500,000 more than the original asking price. So, gives you an idea of the kind of guy Hammond was. He left Montana, like I said, in '98, went to Oregon, built a couple railroads there, and then, along with Daly in 1900 and 5 other investors, they bought the largest redwood lumber mill in California, and Hammond moved his operations to the West Coast and spent the rest of his life up until 1935, mostly in Oregon and in the redwood country. Got into a lot of fights with labor. He had the largest non-union lumber mill in the country, and also had the only non-union transportation shipping line on the West Coast, known as the Hammond Navy. It had 72 ships in the Hammond Navy, and you see this one, Hammond Lumber Company, San Francisco, and it's named the Missoula. So he named his ships after places he'd got a lot of his fortune on. And by the time he died in the 1930s, he had one of the largest lumber companies on the West Coast, and had fully integrated his operations, the largest retail and wholesale outlets in California. This is the world's largest lumber yard in Los Angeles. And he gained a lot of this from his time in Missoula, realizing that the real money was in retail. And so spent quite a bit of his time fully integrating his operations. So he's selling retail, buying lumber from other producers to sell, and also operating a whole string of lumber mills as well. The question is sort of at the end is, was it worth it? We can look around at Bonner, we can look at Samoa, old lumber mills in California, and ask what was the cost? Ecological cost, the cost to human communities. Like many businessmen, Hammond believed that, in Adam Smith's contention, that the pursuit of private wealth results in public gain, and others, especially workers, regarded this ideology of expedience, that wealth came from exploitation of people and nature. And so the question, again, sort of, was it worth it? The question we sort of raised at the beginning of the talk was, why was Missoula so resentful of his success? Certainly for timber workers, Hammond represented everything that was exploitive about the timber industry, but for Missoula actually benefited in many ways from his activity. So why did Montanans harbor such an animosity toward A.V. Hammond? And I guess I'm out of time, so I'll just let you guys figure that one out, and we can converse some questions on.
So I've got a question. Marcus Daly owned a great big mill in Hamilton.
Yes.
Also, and he already owned that mill at the time he was negotiating for the Bonner Mill, I assume. Because he more or less created Hamilton in the 1890s.
He did, and that was part of his conflict with Hammond. Hammond was creating another city just outside of Hamilton. He wanted that to be the center of the Bitterroot, and Daly was using Hamilton because he could get over the Skakalo Pass into Butte and wanted to sort of expand into the Bitterroot. But I don't know if the Bitterroot mill has purchased the Bonner Mill, or if it came later. I don't. Brian, do you know?
I think it happened in the 1890s, so it was after the Bonner Mill.
Well, Bonner was 1898 is when he bought that.
Oh, when he bought it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was built in 1883 or 1884. What's that?
Something like that,
Yeah, by Hammond,
I don't know.
named after his business partner, Bonner.
And you point out that Hammond's, his manager for the Missoula Mercantile Company, which was actually the company that controlled all commerce throughout a large part of Montana with its satellite operations, was McLeod, who was well liked, right?
Yeah. People loved McLeod. They hated Hammond. McLeod, in part of his personality based, McLeod would welcome people in the store. He was easygoing. But he also did things. He saw himself as part of the community and wanting to do things for the community. if you came to him asking for money for Boy Scouts or YMCA or whatever civic activity, he would gladly, go to the drawer and pull out the cash you asked for donation. Hammond, I think I calculated the amount of donations he had made over his lifetime. It added up to less than 2% of his fortune, which for most industrialists at the time, people like Rockefeller and those guys, they're giving away 10 to 15% on an annual basis. And Hammond, I think, over his entire life, gave away 2%.
Greg, do you know anything about the origin of the Hammond Sheriff history at the University of Montana?
The Hammond what?
Sheriff history? K-Law School? was
Yes.
Hammond Sheriff?
Hammond's granddaughter he had 5 children. Most of them were estranged from him, and he had very few heirs, but his daughter married the heir to the Wells Fargo, and so she inherited both the Hammond Lumber Company fortune and Wells Fargo, so she was okay. She did all right for herself. She had one daughter, and that daughter was Frances Field, married a guy named Charles Field, and she actually came to Montana quite often. People that I've talked to still remember her coming, and so she had felt sort of a connection to Montana. So she set up a fund to provide funding for a chair, an endowed chair at UM History Department under her grandfather's name. She also set one up at Stanford for a professor of French literature. So I think there's actually 3 A.B. Hammond chairs in the country at different universities that she had set up in his name.
Anyone else have a question? If not, I have one for Greg.
I have a question. Timber poaching. Is that commonly renowned? I mean, I'm in a room of people who know all about Ponderosa Pine and this gentleman who you've described to a great extent, and I've not known his history. But timber poaching caught my ear. Could you just talk a little bit? Is that still going on?
Probably less so now, certainly, than it did. Timber poaching has a long and noble, if you will, history. People have been taking timber off of land that didn't own. Basically, it's cutting down trees on somebody else's land. So in New Brunswick, the Canadians would go into Maine and cut down the trees to send them down and sell them. The Americans would cross over to New Brunswick and cut down the trees in New Brunswick. And so there's sort of this idea of, it goes all the way back to England, right? You're poaching the king's timber. So taking some timber, and it happened a lot in the American West when land tenure was less well established. So Hammond got in trouble because all of the public lands that had, basically what became the national forest were federal lands, and he went on those federal lands, cut the timber, and made a fortune off of it, selling that timber. It was so commonly accepted that those people who did it, when they're caught, they just paid the fine. It was $2, basically $2 a tree. It was called a stumpage. They considered it a stumpage fee. They would just, like Daly did it, William A. Clark did it, everybody did it, and they would just write a check. And be like, okay, here, to the government when they got caught. Hammond refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. So he spent 25 years fighting this in court. He ended up being convicted, appealing, and then settling on a $100,000 claim for, I think he ended up paying $2,000. So, and that was in 1917, after the timber poaching case goes back to the 1880s. So, that's a long answer. Sorry.
Well, I could add a little bit to that. Until the Forest Service was created, the administration of these federal lands that became forest reserves was very loose, and there was a lot of corruption. And So as Greg points out, politicians could be bought easily to look the other way, and it was very easy to remove timber, real significant amounts from public lands until Gifford Pinchot got an organized Forest Service out there. And then that was kind of one of the reasons there was some significant local resentment of the Forest Service, because all of a sudden, they're enforcing rules to protect the public forest. Well, why are you doing that?
The question I have for Greg is, I think the year was 1867 when the two brothers came west, and at St. Joseph they missed the train, just missed going to Colorado, so they ended up, well, let's go to Montana on the steamboat. Let's just say they caught the train, and A.B. Hammond never came to Montana. What do you think? I assume the role he played would have been taken by someone else, but perhaps not quite as ruthless as he was. But it would seem that in that era, that when there's a vacuum, and that today, whatever it is, when there's a vacuum and people see opportunity, somebody's going to move in and take it. But I'm just wondering if you think it would have just taken a bit longer, or what pathway that might have taken had Hammond not shown up.
That's a good question. So you could sort of speculate as to the Frenchtown may have been where the railroad stopped, rather than Missoula, at least on that end of things. In terms of building the timber industry, that probably would have happened just given the geography of Missoula, or the valley, right? I mean, you got 5 valleys coming in, they've all got timber in them, rivers are flowing, and so it's a natural outsource of it. As far as the university could have been anywhere in the state, really. But in terms of filling that sort of robber baron vacuum, it's hard to say. I think part of it is the personality that's driven. I think Hammond was sort of unique in that he managed to make the transition from pioneer entrepreneur, like Hauser. I mean, Daley died pretty early, but a lot of these guys did really well early on, but they didn't make the transition to the corporate businessman. And Hammond was one of the very few sort of went through that funnel, 1893 especially, and came out at the other end way better off than he started with. And I think for a number of reasons, he was able to make that sort of leap and that transition to a major business, corporate businessman from the pioneer. So I mean, every town has the pioneer guys that go out and build the railroads and stuff. So I think that part of the story is probably fairly standard. So I think you have a good point. I mean, somebody else would have been doing a lot of those things. Yeah.
The mill at Samoa, did he build that mill or did he buy it?
There was an original mill there, the Vance Mill, and then he rebuilt that, and then it became Louisiana Pacific, and a few years ago sold to the Chinese. The Chinese now use that mill to chip redwoods to ship to Japan to make into things like rayon and cigarette packs. And,
Yay.
But I had a question for you guys. If we have time.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, fires, right? Fires need oxygen, heat, and fuels. So, given that fire suppression led to an increase in fuels, and I've come across a lot of things where it says industrial activity, logging led to a lot of fuel buildup through slash and then exposure of forest to more sunlight and drying out of interior forest. And then the other equation, of course, being heat, being climate change. How do you tease out which of these different factors has more of an impact? Is there some way of sort of pulling them apart and saying, well, fire suppression was more significant than, say, industrial logging or climate change? You know, is there any way to sort of be able to sort of scientifically pull those factors out?
Well, one thing that's been an example many times, just about whenever there's been a severe wildfire, when it enters an area that was thinned and the fuels treated, unlike traditional logging, the fuel is often just left, the tops and branches and so forth. But today, very often, the fuel is pretty well treated, so you have tree removal. The stand is opened up, but there's not much heavy fuel. And where that condition has existed, and you have massive wildfire, then the fire behavior has been way less vigorous. The flame length and all that very subdued. It still burns through the area that was treated, but that's why places that have had fuel treatment are generally you're able to save the houses and other developments. So the traditional logging, they just removed big trees, left everything else, you know, and so it wasn't a fuel treatment for the good. It might have been even gone the other way because, as you point out, it opened up more sun. It put more fuel down near the ground from all these trees that were felled in the brush. And the railroads of those early days they were setting out sparks and and the ignition was a big deal. And the public was igniting a lot more fires than they do today, even with a much greater population today. People are more conscious and there's more regulation of being careful with fire.
Yeah, I might add, or just, because you often hear, it depends, I guess, if people, to the extent they're in camps, some would say, well, stands that are thinned are almost always safer, or stands that are thin or logged, however you want to say it, are almost always more fire prone. It depends, like so many things. In other words, if there's good fuel treatment, as Steve mentioned, especially say prescribed burning or if the slash is removed, that would generally make the stand safer from a fire point of view. But if you thin the material and leave it, or depending how you thin, the other thing is sometimes, especially today, especially in the recent past, there were things called thinnings where only trees about this big or smaller were removed. So you can say you thinned the stand, but you really didn't effectively reduce the hazard of the fuels in the crown, the canopy. So it really leaves that stand virtually as prone to a crown fire as it was before you ever treated it. So there's so many variables that it depends, but we kind of know the principles, and those are the things you mentioned. Topography, and of course, weather and topography are two big ones too. So the same treatment on a slope versus a flat terrain could have quite different behavior of fire. So.
And one additional point is that in the Ponderosa Pine Zone, nearly always had relatively frequent fires burning on the ground and reducing the amounts of small trees and shrubs and fuel and so forth. Well, since that doesn't happen to any extent anymore, I mean, there's a little bit of prescribed burning, but it's minuscule. Then we have this buildup of thickets, and that's a whole nother dimension of fuel, which is hazardous relative to wildfire, crown fire.
Do we have 30 seconds or not?
30 seconds, sure.
Just one final statement maybe on that is even Ponderosa pine, almost more than any other species, is highly adapted to fire, providing it comes from below, because it has very thick bark, it has long needles that deflect heat away from the very fleshy buds, so it takes quite a bit of heat to really do damage. And that can, if there's buildup around the base of the tree, that can happen. But generally, they're very, very fire resistant. But all those adaptations through time to fire go out the window if you have a crown fire. So.
I hadn't thought about that.
Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon.